The new NBA season is nearly upon us, so I want to go through all 30 NBA teams and give my take as to who or what I think is the biggest X factor for each team heading into this season. Now, when I say X factor, I'm not saying specifically a player who is an X factor on any given night. When I say X factor, I'm not just referring to an individual player. It could be someone or something that's going to be playing a big role in how this upcoming season looks for each team. So keep that in mind as we get into these. Be sure to let me know what you think the biggest X factor is for each team in the comments. Let's jump right into it, right after this word from today's sponsor. Huge thank you to today's sponsor, Factor. Now, we all live pretty busy lives, and I know personally I have a really hard time finding the time to cook for myself on a consistent basis. That's why I'm excited to be working with Factor, because they offer flexible and affordable meal plans that fit any schedule. Now, I'm a pretty active person. I exercise on a pretty consistent basis, so it's really important that I stay on top of my nutrition while not sacrificing one of the most important things I have, which is my time. And that's what's great about Factor, is they fit any lifestyle, any schedule. So you never really have to worry about if you're gonna have enough time to cook, because it's super simple. All you do is grab whatever meal you want out of your fridge, pop it in the microwave, and then in minutes your food's ready for you. You have a full meal ready to go. And if you realize that you need to skip a week, they make it super easy to adjust your order to accommodate any schedule change or anything that might come up. I love Factor because I never have to worry about if I have enough time to meal prep or if I've got time to go to the grocery store. They take all of the guesswork out of cooking. So just head to factor75.com or click the link below and use code AlexHoops50 to get 50% off of your first Factor box. Once again, huge thank you to Factor for sponsoring today's video and helping make videos like this possible. Let's get back to it. We're just gonna go in alphabetical order and kick it off with the Atlanta Hawks. And there's actually a lot of players that you could choose as the X factor. They have a really solid amount of young talent. I think more young talent than they're often credited for when people are talking about their young cores. They've got Jalen Johnson, DeAndre Hunter, Onyeka Okongwu, AJ Griffin. All of these guys could have pretty big seasons depending on what kind of roles they're looking at and how their development kind of plays out. Honestly, to me, the X factor for this team is still Trae Young. Trae Young is a fantastic player. We got to see him kind of return to form a little bit during the playoffs last year, and I think that was a sign of things to come for the Hawks this season. He seems to be a lot more comfortable under the coaching of Quinn Snyder. It seems like Quinn Snyder's very focused on extracting the best out of Trae Young. If he's able to return to that 2021 season form that we saw him play at, where he was literally a 3-level scorer and efficient from every spot on the floor, while also being one of the most dynamic passers and playmakers in the NBA. If he can get back to that, I think this team has enough talent to where everything's just going to come together for them. And they could end up being a really sneaky team in the Eastern Conference. But all of that hinges on Trae returning to that form more than anything else. Moving on to the Boston Celtics. This isn't really going to be a big surprise to most of you, but after the Jrue Holiday trade, they're not the deepest team in the NBA. I do still think that they have 8 guys that can be comfortable in a playoff setting, and they can still have a solid playoff rotation. But if any injuries happen to any of their main guys throughout this season, it's going to probably have a pretty significant impact on their win total. And then if they encounter any injuries in the playoffs, that's also probably going to cause a good amount of problems for them. So their X factor is pretty simple. It's just their overall health. For the Brooklyn Nets, I really don't think there's a ton of pressure on them heading into this season. They obviously have almost an entirely new roster after trading Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving. So I don't know exactly what to expect from them as a team this year, but their X factor could be one of two things, and maybe a mixture of both. The big obvious answer that a lot of people are going to point to is going to be Ben Simmons, and I definitely think that's a big X factor for them. Obviously, if Ben Simmons isn't able to come back and contribute in some way, in some capacity, and it's less about Ben Simmons coming back and returning to form from his rookie year and sophomore season where he looked like he was on track to be one of the best 20 players in the NBA, maybe even top 15. And now it's just more of a question of, is he going to step on an NBA court again? because he's been dealing with injuries over the past couple of seasons that have set him back. So will he be able to return for them and contribute at some level? And then the other X factor I would say is Mikal Bridges, because it looks like they're going to roll with him as their number one guy, at least for now. But I think they're going to roll the dice and see if Mikal Bridges can be that top guy for them, that go-to scorer. Obviously, he had that stretch at the end of the season last year where he looked like he was going to be able to comfortably be a 25 plus point per game scorer on very solid efficiency, while also being a plus defender at minimum on the defensive end, and potentially one of the best two-way players in the NBA. So that's going to be the big thing for them, is will Mikal Bridges be able to maintain that level of play throughout the entirety of the season? And can the Brooklyn Nets build around him in that role? Moving on to the Charlotte Hornets, it's LaMelo Ball. Is LaMelo Ball going to be healthy? I think if he's healthy, he's going to have no problem being an all-star, fringe all-star caliber player. And I say fringe all-star because the bar for all-star is becoming higher and higher. The last time LaMelo had a healthy season, he was an all-star. He averaged 20 points per game, and the Hornets were a 43-win team, which if you look at the Eastern Conference standings from last year, a 43-win team would have gotten you pretty close to making the playoffs. So if LaMelo's healthy, I actually am not as pessimistic about the Hornets as a lot of people are, but it really all boils down to, is LaMelo going to be able to play? The next team is the Chicago Bulls, and I feel like people have been saying this since he got drafted, but the X factor for them, since they're kind of locked into the core that they're using right now, it's going to be Patrick Williams stepping up and taking a leap in his development and becoming more of an offensive contributor than he kind of has been over the past few years. I would like to see him transition into a role where he's having a little bit more on-ball responsibility. While his overall efficiency did go down this past season, he also had an increase in volume, and he's still one of the best weak side rim protecting wings in the NBA, and obviously has a ton of perimeter defensive potential. So I'd like to see the Bulls get some more out of him on the offensive end. An interesting stat that I came across for Patrick Williams is that in games where he attempts at least 11 field goal attempts, he averages 15.7 points per game on 40% shooting from three on 3.8 threes per game. That's pretty solid and definitely puts him in more of a higher end starter caliber player tier. So hopefully the Bulls just simply give him more shots this year to see what they have, because that could make a big difference for them. Now for the Cleveland Cavaliers, there's honestly a lot of things that you could point at and say this is the X factor for them, but ultimately for them, the biggest X factor to me is going to be Evan Mobley starting to be a little bit more of a contributor on the offensive end. We all know that Cleveland's defense is fantastic. They're one of the best defenses in the entire NBA. They're going to continue to be one of the best defenses in the entire NBA going forward. But for them to really put it all together, they're going to have to improve that offense. And a lot of that's going to start with Evan Mobley being a bigger contributor on the offensive end. Now, I do want to clarify that I'm not, and I don't think anyone should be, expecting Evan Mobley to become some 25 plus point per game scorer next year, or really any year in his career. I just don't think he's wired that way as a player. I think those are very unrealistic expectations. And I'm not even saying that he needs to become some dynamic post scorer. That kind of stuff would help, but really just him being able to attack off the catch on the wing, maybe knock down some three-pointers here and there, because honestly, his catch and shoot numbers are pretty bad. And when you're running him in lineups with Jarrett Allen a lot of the time, yes, their defense is going to be good enough to win them a lot of games, but when it comes playoff time, having two guys who are limited offensive contributors that are mostly relegated to occasional post touches and pick and rolls, you can only lean on everybody else, the other three guys on the floor, to carry your offense. So hopefully he can find more ways to contribute on that end this year. With the Dallas Mavericks, I think you maybe used to be able to make the argument that their depth was their biggest concern, but really I think they did a good job of addressing that for the most part throughout this offseason, drafting Derek Lively, bringing in Grant Williams, guys like Derek Jones Jr. So ultimately, I think the big thing for them this year is going to be figuring out how to make Luka and Kyrie work together. And the reason I feel like this is maybe not a concern, but something to keep an eye on, is the fact that in the 16 games that him and Kyrie played together last season, they only assisted each other a total of 36 times. And to me, with two guys that are that good of scorers and Luka, who is that good of a passer and playmaker, they should have definitely been able to have some sort of two-man game together. And granted, they only played 16 games together, so they maybe haven't had enough time to establish a ton of chemistry yet, and it's kind of showed. So them having a good two-man game that they can really punish teams with on the offensive end is the most important thing for them. You're just simply not going to get the most out of that pairing if they're both operating as individuals when they're on the floor together instead of a dynamic two-man game. Moving on to the Nuggets, it's kind of hard to pick an X factor for them because they're coming off of a title. They have the player that most people would consider the best player in the NBA. So pinning the title of X factor on any individual player or thing is a little bit difficult. Jokic is going to be Jokic. Jamal Murray proved that he's the perfect second option for Jokic and that he can elevate to that star level play that he showed during the postseason last year. Michael Porter Jr. is looking like the perfect complement to those two. And the rest of the roster is still pretty good. The big thing for them is they did lose Bruce Brown, very important piece of their title run last year. So this season, they're going to be relying more on young guys to step up and have more contributions and play bigger roles throughout the season. Guys like Christian Brown, Zeke Naji. These guys are going to have to step up and show that they can play at a playoff caliber level. So unless they're planning on making a ton of moves throughout the regular season on the trade market or buyout market, they're going to have to reach into their bench a little bit and call on some of these young guys to make contributions for them. The Detroit Pistons are kind of in a weird situation for me because they're one of those young teams that they have plenty of young talent, but the big thing for them is they were missing Cade Cunningham last year, and that would have been the thing that potentially would have made them, instead of being one of the worst teams in the league last year, closer to like the fringe play-in tier and hovering around the 10th and 14th best lottery odds. He only played 12 games last season, and ultimately I think it kind of worked out for the Pistons because they were able to kind of throw guys into these bigger roles and have more opportunity than they otherwise would have had. So they really got a chance to see what they were working with, but a healthy Cade Cunningham is going to be the thing that brings it all together. I'm pretty optimistic for them if Cade is healthy because they just hired Monty Williams to be their head coach, and it's possible that they have some sort of leap as a team similar to how the Phoenix Suns did when they had Monty Williams as their head coach. I feel like Monty Williams can have a similar impact as long as he has all of the tools available to work with. I'm not going to dwell on the big X factor for the Warriors. It's Chris Paul. Will they be able to make it work with Chris Paul? Will Chris Paul be able to fit in with the rest of this team? Can they get everyone to buy into their roles and put any egos aside, with the goal being to win a championship? The Houston Rockets are another team where there's a lot of guys that you can point at up and down the roster and say, this guy's the X factor, or this thing's going to be what makes or breaks this team's win total this year. And I think they've done a good job of assembling a more competent roster. They hired a proven coach in Ime Udoka. Jalen Green is looking like he has potential to be an all-star caliber player. I'm super excited for what he's going to do this season. They've got a good amount of young talent, but the guy that I'm watching the most, especially after what he did in Summer League, is Jabari Smith Jr. Jabari Smith Jr. to me is going to be the guy that determines how much longer the rebuild goes on for the Rockets, because it's clear that after giving guys like Fred VanVleet and Dillon Brooks the contracts that they did, Jabari Smith Jr. kind of proving that he was worth the pick that he was drafted with will be what determines if the Rockets are ready for that next step in their rebuild. And if the Summer League was any indication of whether or not that's going to be the case, then I'd be pretty optimistic because he looked fantastic. He looked like a completely different player playing with totally different confidence. And if that's the player that the Rockets get this year, or some version of it, 75% of that version, then they're going to be in really good shape. Moving on to the Indiana Pacers, I don't really have a ton of concerns for this team. I think overall, they have a strong core of guys to move forward with. And their X factor is just mainly going to be about putting it together on the defensive end. They were one of the worst defensive teams in the entire league last year, full stop. So they really just need to focus on becoming a league average defense, because that's going to be a huge difference maker for them. The drafting of Jarris Walker will probably do a lot to help that, and I'm assuming that is some of what they decided to draft him for, among many other things, because I think he's a fantastic player. But just him and Miles Turner isn't going to be enough for this defense to magically turn into at least average overnight. So they're going to have to find a way to get contributions from other guys, come up with some sort of functional defensive scheme that can hide some of their weaknesses and maximize their strengths to the fullest extent. For the Clippers, it's their health. Are Kawhi and Paul George going to be healthy? Because we know that those two are enough to make you a very, 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 very difficult playoff out. But if they're not healthy, it's a different story. They have a decent enough team, but it all comes down to those two being healthy. On to the Lakers. Some might say Christian Wood's going to be the biggest X factor. I don't hate that pick. He's probably the most obvious guy, but I also think that his contract is so low risk that it's not really going to matter if he isn't a big contributor for them, because he's barely making any money. I'd put them in a similar boat to the Clippers, where their health is going to be the big thing that decides what seed they are at the end of the year. The Lakers are at a point where they're a team that is competent enough to make a deep playoff run like they did. And I think overall, they improved the roster during the offseason, and they still have Anthony Davis and LeBron. But they need both of those guys healthy at the same time throughout the season. And something that's worth pointing out is when LeBron missed some time towards the end of the season last year when he had that foot injury, the Lakers proved that they can stay afloat until he comes back, even if he misses a relatively significant amount of time. But I think it's a little bit different of a story with Anthony Davis, because they don't have a ton of positional depth for him. They don't really have a guy who can make up for all that he offers on the defensive end, even to a lesser extent. So I think his health, if he were to miss any time, would put them in a more difficult position than if LeBron were to miss time. They've proven they can stay afloat without LeBron, but with Anthony Davis, I think that task is more difficult. For the Grizzlies, they're going to have to take care of business while Ja Morant is serving that 25-game suspension. I don't think that's going to be a big issue for them, because they've been able to stay afloat without Ja Morant in the past. Over the past 2 seasons, they have a 35-19 record when Ja Morant isn't playing. But they do look a little bit different from last season. They did lose a couple of guys in the offseason. So it's not necessarily an assumption that they'll be able to take care of business like they have in the past without Ja Morant. But that's going to be ultimately what decides what the rest of their season is going to look like after those first 25 games. Are they going to be struggling in an uphill battle to get to the top 4 in the West by the end of the season? Or are they going to be able to put themselves in a position where they're in such good shape after the first 25 games that the rest of the season isn't too much of an issue for them to get a top 4 seed in the West? With the Damian Lillard trade never coming to fruition for the Heat, they're going to be largely moving forward with some of the young guys that were speculated to be included in trade talks. They lost Gabe Vincent and Max Strus, who were big parts of that finals run. Tyler Hero is going to be a big piece of the puzzle for them. We know Tyler Hero can perform at a 6th Man of the Year caliber level. Do they have a guy that can kind of be that third fiddle to Jimmy and Bam? Since they weren't able to get Damian Lillard, Hero's going to be the one that has to make the difference for them, because they're largely running it back with the same team. The Bucks are another team where it comes down to health. They have a fantastic top 4, and the roster definitely starts to look a little shaky the further down you get. Yeah, they have Bobby Portis, they have Pat Connaughton, they have Jay Crowder, they've got Marjon Beauchamp, who I think is going to step up. And I would say for them, it's probably half a guy like Beauchamp being the X factor, and then the other half just being health as a whole. If they have some guys in their top 4 that miss some time throughout the regular season, I don't think that's as big of a deal, because Giannis is good enough to drag that team to the playoffs. We know he's capable of that, but it's more important that the entire team is healthy in time for the playoffs, because if not, things look a little tough for them. Moving on to the Timberwolves, it's going to be a lot about what Cat can do for them alongside Rudy Gobert. We didn't get a ton of time seeing those two together, but the time that we did see them play together, the fit looked a little bit shaky. But since that time, the Timberwolves look like a much different team. They've gotten development out of some of their younger guys. They actually did a good job of improving the roster in the offseason, bringing in guys like Troy Brown Jr. and Shake Milton. But ultimately, it's going to come down to, can Cat be that all-star caliber player that we know he's capable of being that driver and flamethrower from the perimeter, and at least finding a way to make him passable on the defensive end. We know that Anthony Edwards is going to be Anthony Edwards. I think he's poised for a pretty big leap this season, but the success of Cat will really be what determines the ceiling for this team. For the Pelicans, it's Zion. Obviously, it's Zion. If Zion's not healthy, I just don't see this team being able to do a whole lot of anything. They don't have a bad team on paper. I actually really like the Pelicans. I think overall they've built a pretty cohesive and strong roster, but that's only if Zion is healthy and playing. The Knicks were a little bit tough, but I think most people will agree that for the Knicks, it's time for RJ Barrett to make that leap that people have speculated he's capable of making. He's had flashes of pretty much everything throughout his career so far and shown that at times he can be good at just about everything, but now it's time for him to put everything together and be that higher end, potentially fringe all-star caliber player that people thought he was going to be capable of being. The thing with RJ is he doesn't even need to be some prolific scorer. If he can just be a 16, 17, 18 point per game guy on solid efficiency, that's going to be a huge help for the Knicks. But if it's the consistently inconsistent RJ Barrett that we've seen over the past 3 years now, then the road to the Eastern Conference Finals looks a lot more difficult. The easy answer for the Thunder is Chet Holmgren. I think Chet's going to be able to come in and be a solid contributor from day one. And it's less about whether or not he'll be good and more about how good is he is going to be what makes the difference between the Thunder just being a play-in team fighting to get in and potentially being a sleeper for a top seed in the West if everything goes right and development really clicks for them this year. Now, there is a sleeper for an X factor for the Thunder, and that's Vasilije Micic. They've had his draft rights for like 3 years, and they finally managed to sign him and convince him to come over to the NBA. This guy is a 2-time EuroLeague champion. He's won a EuroLeague MVP, and I believe 2 EuroLeague Final Four MVPs. He's a really good player. This isn't a situation where a team is bringing over an obscure draft and stash guy. This guy's a star in the EuroLeague. Obviously, EuroLeague stars don't always translate to the NBA, but if the Thunder can get a higher caliber starter kind of player that can light it up the way that he can, then they're going to be looking even better than they already do. With the Magic, just take every player on the roster and throw them into a hat and you can pick one and say that they're going to be the X factor because they're another young team that has so much young talent to work with, and really their biggest thing is just figuring out who they're going to be moving forward with. The big determining factor is going to be, how good is Paolo this year? Are they a play-in team or are they a playoff team? That's going to be determined by Paolo having a second-year leap. The Sixers, I couldn't even begin to tell you what the plan is for this year because it sounds like they're just going to keep James Harden on the roster for now. They're not really interested in trading him for any of the offers that they've seen so far. So the X factor is going to be, do they even trade James Harden? And if so, what does that return look like? If they don't trade James Harden and they just keep him on the roster and just move forward for the rest of the year with what they have and they try to compete with this roster, then I probably don't see them as a serious title contender, especially with how difficult the East is getting. And they'd probably be more eyeing a retool in this upcoming offseason. That same kind of thing is probably true if they trade James Harden for longer term assets instead of right now assets. But if they trade James Harden and they're actually able to get players that are contributors that can help them win right now, then obviously they're in much better shape. The Suns are another team where you can just point at health, but I think a more interesting X factor is going to be how Bradley Beal performs as apparently the point guard for that team. They don't really have a true point guard unless by the end of the season they have a guy like Jordan Goodwin starting as their point guard, which I'm very high on Jordan Goodwin, so I would love if that happened. But it sounds like Bradley Beal is their point guard, but I do think Bradley Beal is a better playmaker than he really gets credit for, so it's going to be cool to see him operate as the offensive facilitator, especially playing alongside Devin Booker and Kevin Durant. While he might not end up being the 30 point per game scorer that we've seen him be in the past, maybe we'll see him emerge as more of this facilitator on offense, and I think that's going to be really interesting to see. Moving on to the Trailblazers, I don't even know what to consider their X factor because they're probably the most low pressure team in the NBA. It's clear they're rebuilding. It's clear they're going to tank. So if I had to pick an X factor, it's going to be probably a lot about what Scoot Henderson looks like in his rookie year. The Blazers have a somewhat decent assortment of young talent to work with. Obviously, they have Jeremy Grant on that pretty massive contract, which probably hamstrings them a little bit. But some of the problems with that roster become more pressing issues if Scoot is really good from day one. And then they might just be able to ride it out if it looks like it's going to take a little bit longer for him to develop. Now, the Sacramento Kings are another team that kind of fall into the boat of they're mostly the same team. They didn't make a ton of changes this offseason. They're kind of just running it back. But I do think a really interesting X factor for them is going to be Sasha Vezenkov, who they just brought over from the EuroLeague. He was the EuroLeague MVP last year, and he was all Europe first team. If you go look at his resume, it's really long. He has a ton of accolades to his name in international leagues. They signed him to a 3-year, $20 million contract, and that's nothing to sneeze at. That's pretty solid and proves to me that the Kings have a pretty significant amount of faith that he's going to come in and be a contributor and have an impact on their ability to win games immediately. The easy answer for the Spurs is Victor Wembanyama being the X factor, but I'm actually a little bit more interested to see how the rest of that roster takes shape because they kind of have their core three of Wemby, Vassell, and Keldon Johnson, but the rest of that roster are kind of just a lot of question marks right now. I'm pretty excited about some of the guys on that roster, guys like Trey Jones, Malachi Branham, Julian Champagnie, Dominic Barlow. So how soon the Spurs are able to kind of make it back into the picture in the West will be less about how good Wemby is out of the gate and more about how some of these younger guys start to develop around their core three, because I think Wemby's going to be fine, and I think Vassell and Keldon are going to be fine, but they do have to build the rest of the roster. For the Raptors, I'm going with Scotty Barnes. His second season, admittedly, wasn't probably what a lot of people hoped it would be. I think he was shoehorned into a role that he might not necessarily be fit to play. They definitely had this vision that he was going to be this point forward who could basically do everything. And I think to an extent, Scotty Barnes can do everything, but he can't do everything all at once. So I think dialing in his role is going to paint a more clear picture of what the Raptors' future is going to look like, because they're in that no man's land right now. There's a lot of will they, won't they trade Siakam? Will they, won't they trade OG Anunoby? Will they, won't they trade Gary Trent Jr.? And I think a lot of that's going to hinge on what Scotty Barnes does this year. The Utah Jazz fall into the no pressure category of teams. Based on Summer League, it looks like they're probably going to hit on that draft pick of Keontae George, but I won't put the title of X Factor all on him. I think for them, it's just more about how does the rest of the roster start to develop, since it's mostly still just young players. And now last but not least, the Washington Wizards. The biggest X factor for them is going to be Jordan Poole. I don't know if they envision Jordan Poole as their franchise guy moving forward. I don't know if I personally would consider Jordan Poole to be a guy that I would want to build my franchise around. But this year, we're going to find out if he can be that guy. The Wizards are a little more talented than they get credit for. I think some of their problems are not really hitting on a ton of draft picks and not having a ton of flexibility due to that Bradley Beal contract. So now with more flexibility to work with moving forward, I think we're going to learn a lot about what the future looks like for the Wizards, depending on what Jordan Poole looks like. These are all just my opinions, and if you disagree, I want to hear in the comments. Just be nice about it. I know this video is a little bit different from what I normally do, but I really hope you guys still enjoyed it. If this is your first time visiting my channel and you enjoyed the video, be sure to subscribe. Check out some of my other videos if you want to first before you subscribe, and if you like what you see, go ahead and subscribe. Huge thank you to my patrons as always. If you're still watching right now and you stuck around this long, thank you so much. Anyways, guys, I'll see you in the next one.